so much for being here tonight. Welcome to everyone who came from all the corners of Waterloo and beyond. It's so lovely to have everyone in one place after the pandemic where a lot of our events were virtual. It's nice to be in person and in the flesh. So just wanted to say a very warm welcome to you all. So this is our 50th anniversary, as you have heard. The CSCA was founded in 1973 and here in Southern Ontario. And we're an organization that really is at the intersection of faith and science, welcoming people from various disciplines and, community members, anyone who's interested in that dialogue. So we thank you all for being here. And tonight we have the great privilege of having Gary Partlow here for a talk. So the CSCA is hosting a series of presidential lectures where we will hear from various presidents, past presidents of the Waterloo, not the Waterloo, but of the national CSCA, of which Gary is one. The first talk was in BC, British Columbia, where Robert gave a talk, and this is our second of the series of 6 here tonight. So we are very thrilled and excited for that. And before I give the stage over, I just want to let you all know that we're actually having an international conference this year, once again in celebration of our 50th year. It will be hosted July 28th to the 31st at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And it will be a great opportunity to hear from a lot of amazing people who are scientists, theologians, once again in this interface of faith and science. So feel free to come out, put that down in your calendar if that's something that may be of interest to you. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Robert to introduce Gary, our speaker, before we get started for this evening. So once again, thank you everyone for being here, and I hope you enjoy this evening.
Thanks very much, Nyasha. Just to add about the conference, which you see up here, you're all welcome and encouraged to come. We have an exciting lineup of speakers, Victoria Lorimer, a theologian from Australia, Dennis Alexander, biology from the UK. We'll have Joanna Eng, who's going to be talking about information science. We'll have Megan DeFranza, who's going to be talking about gender issues in science. I'm trying to see if I left anybody out. Oh, and we might have somebody named Donna Strickland who won a prize that got her a trip to Stockholm a few years ago. So it promises to be a very exciting lineup, and I would encourage all of you to come. Please see me afterward. I've known Gary Partlow for quite a long time, I think coming on to 30 years now, almost. We met through the Canadian Scientific and Christian Affiliation back in the 1990s, which at one point was the distant future. Now it's the honored past. Gary has been an excellent colleague through the years, and I found to be a fine Christian individual and scientist. I have a couple of stories to tell about Gary. One is about 4 years ago, I was visiting Australia for several weeks, almost 4 years ago from now, actually, in the Brisbane area. And there was a presentation at a church on Australian Aboriginal issues. And I went to it with my wife. We were sitting down and this guy walks in and I thought, boy, that guy looks just like Gary Partlow. And Nancy said, that's not Gary. I mean, he can't be. We're all the way in Australia. He lives he's in Guelph. I said, like, he is a dead ringer for Gary Partlow. And then what happened was, it's because he was Gary Partlow. And it turned out he coincidentally happened to be in Australia at the same time as me. And so we were able to chat again. Another one is where we had a speaker talking about creation issues. And there were a couple of controversial statements made, but at one point, the speaker was trying to use a laser pointer. And so Gary, always being conscientious of service, went out to get one. And he ran down the stairs. The auditorium was elevated. There were stairs. He ran down the stairs waving this thing, and the speaker thought he was going to be stopped. And he said, "I'm used to people being greeted with controversy in my talks, but I've never had somebody try to stop me before." And Gary said, "No, I'm not trying to stop you. I just want to give you the laser pointer." You remember that? Oh boy, well, I know more about Gary's life than he does. Gary is going to be telling us about what it was like in his career at Guelph as an anatomist to be a Christian Scientist in a secular university. So let's give Gary a warm welcome.
So I begin by commenting on the fact that I spent my career as a Christian Scientist in a secular university. My faith journey has been more implicit than explicit. And this has been throughout my life, that I've often just took my faith for granted, whether I was struggling or whether I was being buoyed along. My go-to was based on this little book called Hurrah for the Process, without much thought to what might have been influencing me on this journey. Today, I'll talk about some of the sources of encouragement and support along this journey. Topics that I will touch on include being raised in a Christian home, my church community within the United Church of Canada, the CSCA, of course, and participation during the 1990s in the Bethel Bible series. So the challenges of my experience as a Christian Scientist in a secular university begins with the assumption that all science is based on facts. And to most students, especially in their first understanding, information is black and white, either correct or incorrect. If it's correct, it's irrefutable. As we mature, however, we realize that knowledge continues to evolve over time as more information is gathered. Despite most of you are out of the STEM world, and I'm a biologist, and I'll show you some of the differences. But using this example, at first we thought the world was flat, then round with the sun revolving around the earth. Then Galileo changed all of that and set a new standard. Eventually, Einstein took us to the next level with the theory of relativity, and now we have quantum theory and whatever the current descriptions hold. So even in the physical world, science changes and evolves. This was largely based on equations and formulas, which are exquisite in their preciseness. And in our conversation prior to the formal meeting, that was already expressed. And the preciseness of some of those equations, you think that can't happen by chance. There has to be a plan somehow. In biology, however, my world, not so much. Biostatistics will quickly cure you of any expectation that a precise formula will explain a living phenomena. Why are there always outliers? What do they represent? Should I just ignore them and pretend they do not exist? It's easier to get the line to fit, isn't it, when we just kind of erase those little dots that are scattered outside of what we are anticipating. I remember taking a second-year university course in genetics using fruit flies to explain the genetic process. We'd dump 100 fruit flies out on the desk, and with a magnifying glass, we'd look to see if they had a round body or a long body or long wings or short wings. And he counted them. He just checked that off. When you mate a fruit fly with a characteristic that has dominant XX genes against one with recessive XX genes, the first generation displays the dominant characteristic. The second generation gives a 3-to-1 ratio of the dominant to the recessive characteristic, at least in theory. Sounds neat, it's tidy. But in reality, when the 40 students in the lab that day counted these characteristics on 100 fruit flies, we each had to count 100, and then we added them all together, no one had actually a 3-to-1 ratio. When we summarized the results for the entire class, the ratio was actually 3,097 versus 1,023. Okay, close enough, but not exact. So what was happening here? Does God really work in mysterious ways? Or do we need to keep refining our formulas? Or perhaps both? Every time we think we have arrived, we peek around the corner and see how much more in the universe that the universe has to offer. That's me a few years back, not very long ago, and our two girls. So another dilemma in the scientific world as a faculty member in a secular university was I felt there was a shroud of silence around one's faith, as was mentioned at supper time. How could I be a scientist and profess God at the same time? The two are often assumed to be mutually exclusive. The prevailing sentiment was, and often still is, that only a fool would think otherwise. I didn't want to be considered a fool, so felt compelled to remain silent. My primary passion in my career was teaching anatomy and domestic animals. That's just the plastic pig, by the way, that you're looking at. I did enough research to maintain some semblance of respectability, but it was always a secondary priority. So I could never compete with the big-time researchers. With that putting me at the bottom of the pecking order, I did not want to jeopardize going even lower by acknowledging my faith. And it was not an outwardly hostile environment. It was subtle. I tried a few times to indicate my faith, but you could not ignore the eye roll, the quiet groan, and it stung. One time in the classroom, I was describing the intricate details of the brain, and I paused, perhaps in my own wonderment, and questioned, do you ever wonder how such a complicated system was created? And I said it exactly like that. To which there was a derisive response from one of the students. Clearly, my comment was not welcomed. Had I overstepped my boundary in a scientific classroom? To some, such comments are offensive, while others simply dismiss them. But there are those who also find it threatening to speak of their faith in this space. So how should I acknowledge my faith in such an environment? Knowing that there will be some students, maybe even colleagues, who are allies, struggling to make sense of the apparent contradictions between science and faith. How do I stand with them and support them? Over my career, I'm sorry to say to all of you who are anticipating the answer, I never did come up with a satisfactory answer other than to live with integrity. And I've often contemplated, sometimes wished, that I could have had a career in a Christian university. What kinds of discussions could be generated there? Presumably, not only would one have the freedom to blend science and faith, but also it would be encouraged, probably even expected. Sadly, not so at my secular university. And it seemed that only those with the stature of a high profile, the top ranked professors, they somehow had that permission. But I never felt that I was at that stature and had that privilege. So that silence just seems to linger because you don't feel that you're in a safe place or a welcoming environment where you can share your faith. So what helped me navigate through this paradox, being a scientist, yet professing a belief in a loving God and guided by the example given to us by Jesus? I was supported and influenced in many ways. That's my mom and dad, and that's the home where I grew up in Aylmer, Ontario. I was raised in a Christian home where one's faith was taken for granted, and yet it laid a strong foundation of Christian values. The church was directly across the street from our house. We didn't have a very big front lawn, as you can see, and we could leave the house as the church bells started ringing, announcing the beginning of worship. And we'd be in our pews, sitting and comfortable by the time the minister began to welcome us. For several years, my siblings and I would receive the annual certificate for perfect attendance. That's the gold star. I would be there 50 Sundays out of 52. I think we were allowed to miss up to 3 Sundays in a year, or you would forfeit the gold star. And for the most part, I did not question anything, even the parts that made no sense. For some reason, it was easy for me to just set it on the shelf and not think about it. Does that sound like parking one's brain or shutting off one's brain at the church door when one enters? Maybe, but my faith was so intrinsic and accepted within the security of my family life that questioning didn't occur to my child mind. As I came into my teens, curiosity, asking questions began to enter my life. Whether the Bible stories could actually be true, especially the story of creation. About that time, the United Church of Canada launched a highly controversial new curriculum. If you were part of the United Church, 50 years later, we still refer to the new curriculum. For the first time, I began to see the scriptures less literal and found the interpretations less problematic. For me, creation and the Big Bang plus evolution became the same story. One told philosophically, full of meaning and mystery. The other told scientifically, full of facts and details. Both are important. One tells us about the how, the other explains more about the why, each written in the knowledge and language of the day. So St. Paul's United Church, again in Aylmer, was where I went as a youth. And now Dublin Street United Church in Guelph is where I and my family have been worshiping for more than 40 years, I think. The United Church gave me permission to question and explore my faith. I remember many years ago, one of the congregants asking the minister, would it be okay, almost apologetically, would it be okay to read the books that were being published by members of the Jesus Seminar? And I don't know if you're familiar with the Jesus Seminar, but many biblical scholars came together and spent a lot of energy trying to analyze what words in the Bible can we attribute specifically to Jesus. And if you strip away everything else, you get a pretty thin New Testament when you look at only words that we can attribute directly to Jesus. These writers were people like Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan, and John Spong. And their ideas were almost rebellious. They were shaking some of our beliefs in what they were saying. But they were well-read scholars, and they really, I guess, got the juices flowing. Well, you sort of expected the minister to say, you can't read that bad stuff. It'll have a terrible influence. The opposite happened. He said, this is a great idea. Let's read these books together and have a discussion group around the ideas that are being raised. The books help you to look at the historical and cultural context of the time. And to me, this was enlightening and began to make so much more sense. I always appreciated the freedom and encouragement to explore my faith within the United Church. Rather than telling me what I should believe or what I must believe, I was allowed to develop my own personal understanding. And this kind of encouragement validated my curiosity and thirst for knowledge, which also affirmed my identity as a scientist. And by the way, as a bit of an aside, this is one of the reasons that I'm proud of the United Church of Canada, because of its willingness to take on controversy and not shy away from those difficult areas. It is one of its strengths. So, through the CSCA, we're able to ask questions together. It's why we're here today, for example. I joined the CSCA in 1976. It was just another one of these, and some of you may be in the same position tonight, where someone says, here, come along, you'll find this interesting. It was Dr. Margaret Faulding in our department, a very gracious senior faculty member who invited me to join a CSCA event. And Guelph, somewhere around that time, formed a small local chapter. We hosted several events to the wider community. I'm not aware of that one of professors or our Christians too. I wish I had been part of that. And of course, we entertained the usual evolution versus creation debate. The problem was, it seemed the goal was always to win the debate rather than have a useful discussion in which we learn from each other. Together, our local group published a paper in 1984 in the ASA Journal Perspectives that was in one of the early slides, entitled Christian Guidelines for Biotechnology. I look back on it now and see it is fraught with its simplicity and assumptions, but it did provoke much needed discussion and awareness of the dilemmas in scientific research and experimentation. And I can't even remember the field that was brewing at that time, but it was one of these, I suspect, genetic manipulation technologies that was coming to the front. And the question was rising, what do we do with that? How do we as scientists engage and bring our Christian faith into that conversation? I served on the National CSCA executive for many years and as its chair from 1993 to 95. What always impressed me about the ASA and CSCA was no matter how divided or disparate we were on some point of Christian faith, the discussions were always congenial with a genuine desire to learn from each other. And this is why I encourage you to go to the conference. This is one thing about this organization that makes the difference. And whether it's at the annual conference or the local meetings in the journal or other publications, it's this congenial way that we can come together and have our discussions, our debates, and our disagreements, and do it in such a congenial and accepting way. There's something special about that, and I don't think you find that in many other places. So often the discussion or the debate is us versus them. And with the CSCA, we do it together. The CSCA community understood the dilemmas I was experiencing with articulating my faith in the scientific world. The work we did together helped me explore and express my understandings as a Christian scientist. So I want to move on to one of the things that I found most helpful. I had this underpinning of support that through my family and through my church community and even through the CSCA, that I only look back on and reflect how significant and important that has been. But there was one activity that I got involved with that's probably provided me the best framework for understanding or approaching the scriptures. And that was this Bethel Bible study. some of you may have heard of. It's been in existence for over 60 years. It's been offered to multiple congregations in a variety of denominations worldwide, actually. It encourages you to read the scriptures chronologically rather than sequentially. So you don't start on Genesis page 1 and read all the way through to the last chapter of Revelations. You read it as the story actually unfolded. You do it in over a 2-year time frame. The first year you read the Old Testament. The second year you read the New Testament. It is largely without commentary. You're just looking at what do the scriptures say, not what do people say, what the scriptures say. So it's without the commentary. It's just, these are the words that are presented in the scriptures. It takes a holistic approach, which is a little bit different than usually the way we do a Bible study. So you read a book or several books at one sitting. It's hard sometimes to make yourself sit down and read the entire book of Matthew or the entire book of John. But that's the way you do it. You don't read a few verses or a few chapters. It's holistic rather than the details. You're looking at the big picture. You look at the gradual development of the human understanding of God and the human's relationship with God. And as an example, I don't know if I had seen it. It seems when someone points it out to me now, it seems so obvious. But you look at how our understanding of God has changed or evolved, probably as from a child to an adult, but through the scriptures, from the beginnings in the Old Testament through to the New Testament. Early on, God was confined to a box, the Ark of the Covenant. And whenever you went somewhere or on a journey, you took the box with you because you wanted God to come along, right? And God's in the box, so we take the box. Later, and that was more typical of the Hebrews. The Israeli people began to see God as inhabiting the temple. So if you wanted to connect with God, you went to the temple, pray, or to experience God, because that's where God was, that's where God resided. Our understanding began to expand, and we saw God's presence everywhere, but only for the Israelites. And then lastly, Jesus showed us that God's love is for everyone. So there's an evolution there of our understanding of God that most of us probably have gone through, whether you realize it or not. But we started off seeing God in the box, and then we found God, sitting on the throne with his little crown and so on, and the long robes in the temple. And then we see God is everywhere and everything, but God was only intended for the Israeli people. And then the bigger understanding that God is everybody, everywhere for everybody. So, I spent too much time on that. What I wanted to move on to was these hermeneutic principles. So the Bethel Bible study started by introducing us to hermeneutic principles. And what we mean by that is the methods or the tools that we bring in order to interpret Scripture. What I'm about to present is from a layman's point of view. A biblical scholar would cringe at, and I've tried to have this conversation with biblical scholars, and I can just see them seize up with my naivety in talking about hermeneutic principles in this way. But as a layman, as a scientist, I have found them very helpful. And it was a way for me to begin to make better sense out of the scriptures. So, first of all, I list the principles. And the first and the fifth, we'll talk in a little more detail, but first, just a quick look. Think Hebrew. We will compare Hebrew mindset, the Hebrew way of thinking versus Greek thought. The second is the limitation principle. The Bible doesn't tell us everything about everything. Don't try to make the Bible answer questions. It was never intended to. It doesn't have an answer to every question. It is limited to the location, the culture, and the knowledge at that point in time. And the example, one day a person writes to the minister and says, I'm not going to join your church unless you tell me whether the earth was made in 6 days. And the minister writes back and says, you can join the church when you learn to ask better questions. The third is a historical principle. We have to see the message, the scriptures, in relationship to its historical context. Who was it written for? Why was it written? The literary principle. Biblical writers use various literary forms to convey their message. Poetry, it's obvious in the Psalms or the Song of Mary. Allegory, again, it's obvious when it's presented in parables. Historical facts are usually written in prose. Sometimes the styles are obvious, but often they're not. And if we fail to recognize the literary style, we're looking for facts in a poem. They're not there. The fifth one, spiritual or religious versus scientific principles. The Bible's message and language is religious, not scientific. We'll come back to that. And the shelf principle. So you put preconceived ideas on the shelf. You approach the Bible with an open mind. And the way it was described to me once, when you come to something in scriptures that really doesn't make sense or you're struggling with, sometimes it's better just park it and then come back to it at some point. As your knowledge, as your understanding increases, you may come back to the shelf and pull that problem off and look at it again. Maybe by that point, it's irrelevant. You toss it. Or now you begin to understand what the intent is or what the issue is and can deal with it. So that's the shelf principle. So thinking Hebrew. This is hard for me to do. And those raised in Western culture tend to think with a Western mind based on Greek thought form. We're logical, systematic. We take pride in accuracy. We want all the pieces to fit together. But when you start to make the comparison, the Eastern, and by the way, when I say Eastern, that's including Oriental, Indigenous. You'll start to see the connection as we go, versus Western. So the Hebrew thinking is holistic. It sees the big picture. Western or Greek thinking is analytical, looks at the details. Hebrew thinking is often poetic, where the Greek is prose. We want it straightforward, just the facts, ma'am. The Hebrew asks for meaning. Oh, my list is slightly different. Feelings. Hebrew thinking often involves or it includes emotion, where it's just the thoughts. Corporate or the community is of utmost importance. To the Greek, the individual is more important. Corporate, it's between God and the community. The individual, it's between God and you. Hebrew is dynamic, it's flowing, where we're looking at I keep saying we. My daughter said, stop saying we, but we is me in the Greek mind. And I suspect several of you may identify with that as well. We tend to be static. We want a point in time that we're dealing with. Your self-worth in the Hebrew thinking is how much you're able to give away in your life. Our self-esteem is based on how much we accumulate in life. I'm the king of the castle, then I must be at the top. I have great self-esteem. Hebrew thinking, paradox, controversy is okay. We're not seen to be bothered by it. The story doesn't have to go in a straight line. We kind of meander, we get there, we have a distraction, we come back. For the Greek mind, contradiction is unacceptable. We want to know what's the truth, what is accurate. If we've got a contradiction, which one is right? In the Hebrew thinking, both can be right, even though they're contradictory. And in presenting that, I need to say there's nothing judgmental about these differences. They simply reflect that different cultures have different ways of thinking about things and processing information. So another of our hermeneutical principles is spiritual versus science or scientific. And spiritual or religion, I interchange those. So this is important in the way we approach scripture as scientists, recognizing that the Bible has a spiritual thrust. It's not scientific. It's not meant to be a scientific textbook answering questions on how things happen. It's meant to reveal spiritual insights and truth in God's encounter with humankind. So it will ask questions on why, where scientifically we're always asking questions on how. How does that happen? The spiritual is looking for meaning. We want an explanation. The spiritual look for the significance in the story, where we dissect the story, and sometimes until there's no story left. The spiritual is indifferent to details. To the scientific mind, the details are what it's all about. Spiritual is okay with mystery and awe. Scientific, everything has to follow the laws of nature, the laws of physics. In the spiritual, we're often involved emotionally. In scientific, we're detached. You know, when you do the experiment, you probably don't have a whole lot of personal attachment to what is happening other than I want this experiment to work so I can have my PhD or my next grant. But we're not personally involved in the details and the outcome. Spiritual writings and scripture are okay with exaggeration. Or hyperbole, sometimes it's referred to. Numbers are symbolic. When we say 40, yeah, thereabouts. So 40 is a generation, right? When you hear the words 40, we're talking about generation. So Moses lived for 3 generations. So he died when he was 120, not 119, not 121. He died when he was 120 to the scientific mind, because that's accurate. That's what the details say. That's what the numbers stand for. Okay, so yeah, we want the factual, accurate details. So applying the appropriate interpretation principles to scripture allows us to see the meaning rather than getting hung up over the details. Now you're looking at this thinking, okay, what's this got to do with the talk? Well, we're in the Garden of Eden, and this is the snake. The scientists would say, have you ever wondered how the snake was able to talk to Eve? Has that ever crossed your mind? Does a snake have vocal cords? And when we continue that line of thinking, we need to search the fossil record for evidence of vocal cords in snakes. And if we could find one, we would be much more comfortable with this story. In contrast, the Hebrew mind doesn't care whether the snake has vocal cords. In fact, what's that really got to do with the story? When Karl Barth was asked whether the snake has vocal cords, he replied, that's not what is important. What is important is what the snake said. Now, I probably don't need to put the headings on here. In fact, I debated should I take that off and then see if you could decide which one of these represents Greek thinking and which one represents Hebrew thinking. So the Greek keeps their lawn manicured. It's neat, it's uniform. Everything's evenly cut. There's no weeds or bugs. Thanks to insecticides and herbicides, we're going to make Mother Nature fit our way, our blueprint. This is how it should look. The Eastern mind, the lawn or the yard, it's uneven. It's full of weeds and flowers, as well as some grass. And then the Greek, steps back and looks at this from our nicely manicured lawn, and we cast judgment on the other. This unkempt, natural yard must belong to someone who is lazy, disorganized, unmotivated. So we missed the point totally through this, seeing the world through these different eyes. So finally, we'll move on to a couple of scriptures as I continue to make this point. Here we have Jonah and the whale. This obviously scripture from the Old Testament. So in my mind, when I was looking at the story for the first time, and I still do, it still kind of passes through my mind. I try to push it away, but it keeps coming back. Is whether was it really a whale, or perhaps it was a very big fish? Because some versions of the Bible say it's a fish, not a whale. Yet I've never seen a fish big enough to actually swallow somebody. So I doubt it was a fish that big. And if it was a whale, did it really swallow Jonah? And if so, how did Jonah survive in its stomach? I mean, the pH, the acid, right? It's going to chew it up. How did it breathe? Did the whale gulp a big volume of air as it swallowed? So there was a little bit of air down there so it could breathe. These questions are quite perplexing. Now, from the Hebrew perspective, what is the story about? God asked Jonah to go to Nineveh to preach. Jonah didn't want to go. He rebelled. He fled in a sailing vessel. God or Mother Nature intervened, caused a big storm. Jonah fell overboard. The whale swallowed him up, swam towards Nineveh, and spit him up on the beach. And Jonah concludes he should really do what God told him to do. What's the message of the story? We should obey God's purpose for us and follow God's instructions. But meanwhile, the Greek mind is still trying to figure out the pH of the whale's stomach. So if we get caught up in the details of the story, we often miss the message, or worse, misinterpret the message. So lastly, scripture from the New Testament, the birth of Jesus foretold. This is one that I had struggled with for a long time. From Luke chapter 1, verses 26. I'll read a little bit of it to you. And as I'm reading it, see which mind you're using to follow. Are you following this story with the Greek mind, as I always have, or are you using the Hebrew mind? In the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary, and he came to her and said, "Greetings, favored one. The Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. Mary said to the angel, how can this be, since I am a virgin? The angel said to her, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be holy. He will be called Son of God. And now your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, has also conceived a son. And this is the 6th month for her who was said to be barren. For nothing will be impossible with God. Then Mary said, here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word. The angel departed. So what do we do with this story? Well, in the scientific mind, first, I would try to decide how old was Elizabeth. She was old. She was barren. Then I compare that with the oldest age possible before menopause. So what would be the oldest age for Elizabeth to conceive? Also, if Zechariah was infertile, how did that change? I'm sure they didn't have the surgical technique for artificial insemination, or did they? Did the writer just leave this out of the story on purpose or maybe by mistake? And then what about Mary? Was she really a virgin? I mean, you can't become pregnant as a virgin, not biologically or scientifically. Or was this just a fabricated story so that the neighbors would not say anything negative? In my generation, that's what happened. If someone, a young woman, became pregnant, she would somehow disappear for 4 or 5 months. The family would keep them in the basement or in hiding while they became pregnant, had their baby, and then they could come out looking normal again, so that you didn't embarrass the family. So maybe that's all this story is about, right? We just fabricate a story to somehow justify or rationalize how the Virgin Mary could become pregnant. We want a logical explanation. But what if we think Hebrew instead and look for the meaning, this time stated conveniently in verse 7? For with God, nothing is impossible. Oh, so that's what this writer is trying to tell us. With God, nothing is impossible. That's what the story is about. Not how old Elizabeth was, not whether or not Mary's really a virgin or not. It's just a way of telling us God can do whatever. So in conclusion, the first thing I want to leave with you is think Hebrew. And most of us, it's not everybody, by the way, in Guelph and Waterloo are Greek in their mind. I have one daughter who's very Hebrew or Eastern in the way she thinks. But for those of us who tend to think in this way, when you approach scriptures, you need to kind of change gears and come at scriptures thinking Hebrew. And lastly, I want to thank the CSCA and the ASA providing a welcoming community where my faith and science journey are validated. So that's
Okay, well, thank you, Gary. And I think we do have refreshments there if some of you want to get some while we have questions, but I hope you're willing to entertain a few questions and comments. So please go ahead. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask Gary?
You said that sometimes you maybe wish that you picked a Christian university or Christian institution in which to do your work. Is there a reason that you chose the University of Guelph, or, was it kind of...
Yeah. I'll come at your question kind of roundabout. Certainly in the States, there are many Christian universities or colleges. And I'm only an outsider looking in, making the assumption that that's a good environment where you can live out your faith and your scientific career. Hopefully that's true, and hopefully not the reverse is happening, where everything has to start with religion and science is the bad guy and gets pushed aside, as we were talking at supper time. I've never thought of it in the reverse way previously. But in academia, I don't know if it's, I need to be careful in the way I say this, but Christian universities and colleges were often looked down on as second class. It's where, if your career wasn't going well, or you just weren't making it, or you wanted it kind of an easier go of it, you weren't that good a publisher, a Christian college would be a good place to be, because the rigor, the science isn't as strong. I don't know if it's fair to say that, but that certainly prevailed through my career, whether it still does today. There are some very good Christian colleges that I have become aware of. I've been impressed, and again, going back to the annual conference, some outstanding speakers, some of our best scientists are strongly Christian, and they make their whole presentation from the point of view of a Christian. Having said that, I don't know, but I suspect for most of you, certainly for me, you don't really choose where you wind up. I don't know if I ever made a decision, I'm going to go to the University of Ottawa next. That's where I was sent. That's where there was a lab that was willing to take me. I don't know if I chose to come to Guelph. That was the only job that was in front of me at that time. Some people are comfortable with movement. They spend 3 or 4 years of their career in one university, and they move on. And usually every time you move on, that's a promotion. That's how you get from assistant to associate. That's how you get from associate to full professor. You move. That's how someone buys you out with a lot of money to get you to come. Others, like me, not as comfortable with change. I'm comfortable here. Things are okay. Things are working. I'm allowed to publish at a low level. I have a passion for teaching. I'm encouraged to do that. So I'm not complaining about the University of Guelph or my experience there. But as some of you expressed at dinner time, that struggle was always there. Can I be open about my faith? And can I do it without losing credibility? And most of the time, for me, the answer was no. Don't do it. Don't go there. You'll offend people. You lose your credibility. And you're young. Most of you are young and naive, and you think that academia is pure and for the good of all. And you'll become jaundiced or cynical as your career goes on. Some of you, as you see the old boys club and the politics, and not all promotions are based on merit and so on. I don't know why I'm rambling on like this, but we have a question here.
Thank you, Gary. Actually, I admire how beautifully you connect your private life to your professional life, and you connected your profession to your faith. I have a question. Maybe other member of the affiliation can reply to my question. I wonder how much you call it. You are a like-minded community. I wonder how much you value young thinker, young writer, think tank in your affiliation. In AI field, we do have a big part. We call it deep thinking. Through deep thinking unit, people through a neural network, they can predict. I mean that we do have a lot of new, thought in AI that can be a good connection between technology and faith. But unfortunately, it really happened rarely for me to read an article about the connection of AI with the faith. I wonder if you have any encouraging thinker or think tank or maybe writer to write about it.
Well, the ASA, so I don't know if that it's clear to you. The ASA, the American Scientific Affiliation, is the parent group, the original group that started many years before. And then the CSCA came along and became affiliated. I don't think anymore we would say, well, you're the parent and we're the junior. I think we like to think we're equal. But they have a much larger and stronger organization. And they have a journal, Perspectives. I'm not going to be able to say the whole title. Perspectives in
Science and Christian Faith, CSCA.
When I first came upon that journal, I thought, it's a bit Mickey Mouse. I mean, it's from one of these Christian colleges. It's actually quite rigorous. And there's some fairly deep conversations in that. AI, I don't know.
There's some AI.
There's some. I don't read the journal as often as I probably should because most of it, so it's so intellectual. I have trouble following a lot of it. It's not simple enough for my type of faith. I sometimes say I have a simple faith. I don't think it's simplistic, but I don't do the deep theology, perhaps, the way some do. And I find that journal tends to be, it is rigorous. It's a legitimate journal. I don't know how readily it's accepted in the scientific community. But the ACA also encourages forums, and they have quite a variety of forums on different topics. I don't know that there's one on AI. If there's not, there should be, given the way it's evolving right now. It's sort of like the early days when we struggled with biotechnology. AI is a conundrum that most scientists and Christians are going to have to struggle with. ASA would be the forum. That should be the theme of our next annual meeting.
One of the speakers at the meeting this July will be Joanna Hang, will be speaking about that. Is that getting at your question?
Yeah, actually, I only brought one example of AI. Maybe I believe that in biology, in different fields, we do have different thought that they need room to come along with you, your community, you are a like-minded community. They need your encouragement, maybe even they need make money through that. But your community need to create content for the public.
Yeah, and I don't know how well the ASA or the CSA reaches out to the public, reaches out to the local church, not as well as we should. That dichotomy almost as exists, as I indicated at supper time. Well, the church of my faith is over here, and I work on my faith when I'm in that community, and science is over here, and I work on my science when I'm in that community, and one's just a few blocks from the other, and they don't come together very often. You did make a comment about youth. There has been, I would say, a fairly noticeable increase in student involvement in both the ASA and CSCA, and support being provided for that. It's often the students who have the creativity and don't have the harnesses or whatever, that kind of hold you back. They don't seem to be afraid to say what they're thinking. and ideas pop out, and it generates a lot of excellent discussion because they often are less inhibited. They haven't been stung quite as many times, and those ideas will flow. And so it's very much encouraged. And at the conference, there will be events that are designed and directed just for students, just in the early careers, people as well. So they do cater to that. I think these two organizations are trying to do what you're asking for, and there are other organizations. Christian geologists and
there are some subgroups.
But
there's Christians in science in Britain, ISCAST in Australia.
Yeah, but not a lot, and they're not. I mean, when the membership of the ASA is 2,000 to 3,000, I don't know what that compares to as how many scientists are there? 1 million. So it's not a big presence, and it should be. There's a question back there.
Yeah, but before I get a question, I'll just add that the last annual meeting of the ASA, which was in San Diego last July, there were just over 200 registrants, and there were 60 of those registrants were students, and they were very pleased with that ratio, and it really added a lot of life to the conference. Now, Gary, my question is, when we were sharing some of your thoughts early on about what you might be speaking about, you shared with me the comment, I think, so I wanted to clarify that you thought that maybe the science and faith interaction environment in academia now is a little better than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Did I misinterpret what you were saying, or do you hold to that?
I think yes and no. I think it's still a struggle. And if you've been here at the supper hour, Rob asked that kind of question. And as we sat there and student after student commented, it sounded like exactly my story. And this need for silence. I can't be open and share my faith. So I'm not sure that is changing a whole lot. I wanted to just tell you one part of the story. So I'm sitting here in my little silo, afraid to make a comment about my faith in the BSc program committee or at a faculty meeting or something, where it feels like someone's got to stand up and say something about this. There's more to the world, there's more to the life, there's more to meaning than science. What I found, I don't remember the activity, but I had to go around to different United churches, mostly, to make some kind of announcement about an event that was happening. I'd stand up there in the pulpit and I'd look out and I'd think, holy gee, there's my colleague sitting there in the pew. Well, there's another one there. Well, there's someone up here. Then I'd go to another congregation. I was even over in the Anglican, and one of the last people in my department, there she's sitting a few pews over from me. So we're out there in a lot bigger numbers than I think anyone admits. But no one's standing up and saying, here I am, who's going to join me? We're all sitting there on our hands saying, not me. I'm not going to admit it. Yeah, so I was rather struck by that. And of course, then we come back to work on Monday. No one says a word. Hi. Yeah.
Got a question here? Yep.
I have 2 questions.
Sure. Go ahead.
So the first one is, I'm from Africa. And being in university, we have a different way of expressing our faith. It's still open. I can preach in an amphitheater. They will not stop me. Right? I will preach on the streets of the university. They will stop me. The topic here is I'm a physicist. Okay, I work at the Biomedical Institute. And I have to really think about a different way of evangelism. And I feel like it's an opportunity more like a threat. Right? Because there's a way I live my life. For example, if I'm fasting, and you ask me, why do you not come to eat the group? I'm fasting. Why are you fasting? okay, now I give you the spiritual meaning of why I'm fasting, right? So I feel like there might be opportunities the Spirit can use for us even to evangelize in this kind of politically correct society.
Yeah.
Now, my second, that's first point, my question about the Hebrew way of thinking. Being a physicist, when I think about a miracle like Peter walking on the water, for me it's impossible. It's like literally impossible.
Yeah.
So if I have to take the Hebrew way of thinking of saying, okay, let me just accept that God can do something impossible, still doesn't connect with my scientific mindset, because unless it is really impossible, like, I mean, it could be anything, right? So unless it's something that I cannot explain with science, I cannot deem it a miracle.
Yeah, and that's the problem is you're slipping back into you're still looking for a logical scientific answer, whether that's conscious or subconscious. It would be, to me, it's trying to answer why was he walking on the water, not how was he walking on the water. What was the point of that? Was it not him reaching out to join Jesus? Wasn't that what the story is about? Doesn't matter whether he walked on water or walked across the beach. He was taking a difficult route to try to connect with Jesus. So it's not looking for an explanation, like it's a miracle or with God's all is possible. It's trying to figure out what's the message. Why did the writer tell us that story? The writer wasn't the least bit concerned that that's impossible. The writer's trying to tell us something else. I'd have to go back and read the scripture and think about that to see what kind of message I got out of it. But in doing so, I would be trying to set aside, it's not possible, couldn't be done. Why did he get halfway and sink? That's not part of the story. Those are the details. I'm looking for the message. What's the meaning in that story? Why was that story told?
Did that get at your question?
Yes.
Do we have any others? We may have time for one. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I heard you grew up in a Christian household. So
Yeah.
at what point in your life do you think you start taking your faith seriously? Like maybe you realize Jesus really is the objective truth, or
Yeah, that's I go back to the very first thing I said, that it was, for me, it was implicit. It wasn't, even as I was trying to put this talk together, that kind of a question, was there a point in time that I can identify that something happened? I can share one point in time where I tried to make it happen. And that was during my postdoc in Wisconsin. And we wound up going to a church. It was a Wesleyan United or something, somewhere in between liberal and conservative. And so there were a lot of people in that congregation where there was a moment, the bolt of lightning. They were struck, or they suddenly became aware of God's presence. And for me, and I did present this to the congregation many years ago, it was, the first question is, why hasn't that happened to me? I think I've been a Christian my whole life, and God has never reached out and given me a zap or whatever, right? There was never that moment. What am I doing wrong? Or what is wrong with my faith? Is my faith not strong enough? How come I haven't reached that special point in time where I knew that I was a Christian? And I tried to make it happen. And near the end of my postdoc, I went to the pastor and I said, I want to accept Jesus. I want that moment. And the pastor talked about the weather and how was sailing, because he knew I liked sailing. And his wife says, Gary wants to go to the church and meet Jesus or accept Jesus. And the pastor says, oh yeah, well, we can do that. So we got in the car, and his car, we drove up to the church, and we walked up to the front of the church, and he stood there, and I probably got down on my knees, and I'm sure he put his hand on my shoulder or my head. I don't remember the details. And it went through what felt like a little ritual. And I thought, nothing happened. I didn't feel a thing. And to the minister, the pastor, it was there, we did it. Is that okay? And I guess so. And I got up and walked out and didn't feel any different. And that has been my faith journey. I shared that with some, and I always felt inadequate because of that. I did get to a point when I tried to share that with my congregation. We were doing, lots of different people week by week would get up and do a little testimonial. That was my testimonial. And I kind of left it with how inadequate I felt. One of the retired ministers in the congregation said, you're probably speaking for 90% of us out there, including him, which was reassuring that I could still be a Christian. I could still profess the faith, even though I didn't have that moment in time where it all began. And I don't know whether that was partly because of my parents and the way I was brought up. I was just accepted. Having a faith was normal. It was natural. And through these other means, I was personally inside, I could put science and faith together. Not easily at first, but gradually. They're different parts of the same story, and I've become quite comfortable with that.
Yep.
Sorry, you talked, both about science and spirituality as those separate spheres of the two buildings down the street,
Yeah.
also the street reconciling.
Yeah,
And I was just kind of
and still don't.
Yeah. I was just wondering if, your faith influenced your professional choices, your career path in any way. As a young person who's kind of trying to figure that out.
I probably, in my earlier days, until I had been rebuffed and stung a few times, was more outward about trying to express my faith. And it was partly out of trying to encourage young people like many of you who are having the same struggles. And I'm at least one step further down the road and should be able to say it's okay. There are people standing there with you, sharing the same struggles, though even those well into their career. What you said was well stated when someone asks why you are fasting. That opened the door for you. They asked, then you were allowed to respond by sharing your faith. And so that's the only thing that I could do in a day-to-day way was try to provide opportunities or allow a door to open so someone might have the courage to ask or somehow indicate it. It's not the first time I had said, I did it in a lecture on the heart. Yeah, isn't this an amazing creation? And I said that quite intentionally. And this kind of hushes silence, and then you just quickly move on. But to me, it was a way of saying, if there's anyone out there where that has crossed your mind and you want to talk more about it, I've just opened the door a crack for you to initiate that conversation. But
I think she wants to follow.
Yeah.
Well, I was just saying, other than connecting with other Christians that were maybe in the same discipline, did your faith impact the work that you chose to do, or your choice of career, or how you decided to make professional choices?
Probably not directly. Indirectly, as I made the comment, living with integrity. Making choices with integrity. I occasionally, it's funny how you can dance around your faith. In the BSc program committee, two well-known atheistic professors who slapped down students in a second-year course on evolution of any possibility of creative God, brought a course to the program committee to introduce this new course on evolution as a fact, solid, cast in stone, cannot be questioned. And I stood up in the room and rebuffed them and said, impossible. I don't know how you can call yourself a bona fide scientist bringing forward a course like that. As I indicated, science is not cast in stone. What's wrong with you? And we never heard from that course again. Never came back to be its program committee. I was acting out of integrity. I didn't say because God is real, but I knew there were people in the room knew that's exactly what I was saying.
I think Nyasha, you want to?
Yes, I just want to thank you, Gary, for just an engaging talk. I really enjoyed it. I just have a quick question. You've shared your story and your journey, the triumphs, the struggles, and it was really just so great and enlightening. I have a question for all the people here who are still students or early career. What tips or advice do you have based off of your experience and your journey that if you could say, hey, I could share a few nuggets from my years, these would be it, pearls of wisdom.
Well, for me, I go back to that little book, and I knew the author at the time, her off for the process. He is embarrassed by the fact that he wrote that book. For me, it still says it all in my faith journey. I was swept along. I don't know that there were very many points along my journey where I intentionally, consciously made a decision or a choice of this is who I was, this is the career I wanted, this is the faith I wanted to share. It just seemed to unfold. And partly, you need your support. You need people around you. You need to be part of the CSCA or a similar place. If there's a church that takes science seriously, I haven't found one, but there must be some out there. You need somehow a community that is like-minded, where you can ask those questions, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Well, go ahead and ask it anyways, in an environment where people will listen and let you struggle with it and not say this is the answer, but allow you to find your own answer. The other little piece, and my daughter, who's an academic and is struggling with it, is sometimes in the academic community, maybe in the world, it's important to be honest and truthful, but in academia, don't tell them anything more than they have asked. You tell them what you have to tell them. You tell them honestly, but you don't need to bare your soul. And especially if you're in an environment where you think that will come back to bite you, whether it's your faith or anything else. I don't know how relevant that is to our talk, but that's certainly one of the things that I have learned, and one of the mistakes my daughter continually makes. She's your age, older, and I keep telling her, you keep your cards close to your chest. You don't tell them when you're contemplating a move or you're contemplating a change. If they haven't asked, none of their business. I don't know whether that's, Rob's a very different academic than I. Rob's the researcher, a scientist. I'm the teacher. My passion has always been students, and trying to help students bring the best out of themselves.
I think, unless there's a burning question, I think maybe this is a good time to stop. Let's thank Gary again.